just to introduce myself a little bit, my name's Anthony. I'm a member of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. We produce this newspaper. It's produced by the Revolutionary Communist Group, which I'm also a member of. I've been involved in the Hands Off Somalia campaign since the start, pretty much. We've been having weekly meetings and events like these, and I have to say it's been a really massive opportunity and experience. A very sharp learning curve, and it's a really good campaign. I urge you to all get involved. My speech really is going to be about Britain and a sort of anti-imperialist perspective into Britain's role of undeveloping Africa as a continent and exploiting its people and its resources. I'm going to start. In 1924, Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese revolutionary, pointed out some key figures in 1924 about Britain and its colonies. Britain, area 151,000 square kilometers, population 45.5 million. 45.5 million. British colonies, area 34.9 million square kilometers, population 403.6 million. I think I got that right. Yeah. This is in 1924, yeah? The British colonies were, as a whole, 8.5 times more populous and about 252 times bigger than Great Britain itself. Britain was the largest colonizer by far, ranking above France, US, Spain, and Italy. It is on this basis that Britain today has become one of the world's strongest, richest, financial powers, looters, and the ex-colonies across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are not. More recently, Britain and the US have been permanently at war since 1991, the year of the Soviet Union's collapse. As the US today seeks to achieve and maintain global hegemony, domination, with Britain as its partner. These battles take place wherever the value is located. What we are seeing today in Africa resembles the colonial scramble for strategic territories and resources played out by the major imperialist powers a century and more ago. The global crisis of capitalism is producing a repartitioning of the world. In 1993, so that's quite a long time ago now, that sounds like my childhood or something, but that's long ago, but highly relevant still, yeah? An Oxfam report gave a warning and spelled out the facts. Average incomes in Africa have fallen in 1993 by a quarter since the mid-70s. The number of people living below the poverty line rose from 184 million in 1985 to 216 million in 1990. Africa joined amongst the other most oppressed regions of the world in experiencing a continual fall in income per capita throughout the 1980s, a process which has continued into the 90s. In the case of Angola, in 1993 again, a major producer of oil and diamonds in capital Luanda, a staggering 84% of the population was jobless or underemployed. Inequality between the highest and lowest income deciles increased from a factor of 10 to a factor of 37 between 95 and 98 alone. More recently, 2007 in Angola. Angola earned more than $30 billion from oil exports, but according to the World Bank, 70% of the population live on less than $2 a day, and 1 in 4 children died before their 5th birthday. 1 in 4 children died before their 5th birthday. If you think Spain or Greece is in crisis, African nations have been experiencing such a crisis continually for decades and centuries. By 2008, African debt from 1980 had been paid back 4 times more than what was originally borrowed, a total of $255 billion. The All-African Council of Churches called Africa's debt burden a new form of slavery, as vicious as the slave trade. Angola has oil. What about Nigeria? According to UNESCO in 2010, 92% of Nigeria's population, about 150 million people, lived on less than $2 a day, with 71% on less than $1. Most poverty alleviation programs were mere direct transfers of cash to politically selected beneficiaries, often deposited back in Western banks. 41% of children under 5 had stunted growth due to acute malnutrition. According to the report, 15 million Nigerian children perform hazardous work in mines, fisheries and agriculture, or work as street vendors. Many parents cannot afford to educate their children. Unemployment is 50% and youth unemployment 71%. Remittances from the outside, so that's money that families send back home, is worth 4% of GDP but has fallen due to the capitalist crisis. Meanwhile, the elites live in opulence and corruption is rife, as it is in this country also amongst the elite. For example, Nigeria's public debt, wiped out in 2005, had mysteriously risen back to 35.3 billion in 2010, despite booming oil prices. Remember, oil in Nigeria was struck in 1956. So what we're hearing today about Somalia, and that oil can develop the country, we can learn a lot of lessons about what has happened to the other African nations in the hands of Western imperialist oil corporations and governments. Okay, history has taught us a legacy of colonialism. In the powerful book, which I'm sure many have read, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, by Walter Rodney, the Guyanese scholar, he took the example of how the firm Unilever, which you might know produce a lot of cosmetic and consumer products. He used this company to explain imperialism and how colonialism left a long-lasting impact of underdevelopment on Africa, but enriched the bourgeoisie in Europe, and namely Britain. Unilever is now the third largest consumer goods firm in the world. Its market value is £27.3 billion, more than many of the poorer African nations combined. A company has more money than many African nations put together. However, in 1885, Unilever, which was represented by William H. Lever, was selling just 40,000 tons of soap. The raw materials themselves came from West Africa. In 1902, Lever sent his own explorers to the Congo to find more raw materials, palm produce, and his sales expanded. The ruling Belgian government in the Congo was willing to offer huge concessions of land to Lever. Lever went on to purchase a foothold in every West African colony. After the First World War, grand mergers happened between all of the big soap companies and similar products as competition was bought out by Lever. At this point, Unilever profits rocketed worldwide, except in Eastern Europe, where the factories were nationalised. Capitalist giants Unilever began to purchase many other companies in Britain, purely funded off the capital extracted unfairly from the African continent. The rich were getting richer. To quote Rodney, "The exploitation of Africa gave European monopoly capital full opportunities to indulge in its tendencies for expansion and domination." Divide and rule. Rodney went on to explain that Africa was being used as a way to bolster up the capitalist system in Europe that has its own contradictions, and as we're seeing today and we have seen many times before, is continually in crisis itself. The principal contradiction in the capitalist system is between the worker, the one that does all the work, everyone probably here, and the capitalist. To keep the system going, the capitalist must step up the rate of exploitation of the worker. At the same time, European workers were gaining more and more rights through struggle and mastery of the production and the factories and the mines, as is natural as would happen in any situation. If the bourgeoisie were to continue to demand more and more of the worker, more and more profit, and to oppress them socially and politically, then the two classes will be set on a collision path. The capitalists were clearly afraid of Marx's prediction that this class conflict would come in the form of revolution, where the workers would emerge victorious. So therefore, imperialism introduced surplus from the exploitation of Africa, as the sister talked about earlier, by oppressing Africa workers more, to partly offer a few more benefits to the European workers as a bribe, better wages, better conditions, better social services, which are now under attack, the cuts. Meanwhile, the European capitalist still made his fortune, and the oppressed masses still suffered with no benefit in wage increases from the cheap goods offered to Europeans and North Americans. The European workers paid a great price for the few crumbs they have received from the imperialist table. The class in power controls the media, the misinformation, the miseducation, to the point where these bought-off sectors have become allies in the colonial oppression of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, rather than seek political power themselves. Once again, in the words of Rodney, in accepting to be led like sheep, European workers were perpetuating their own enslavement to the capitalists. I just want to quickly talk about arms. World military expenditure in 2000 was $810 billion. In 2006, 6 years later, it reached $1.2 trillion, and in 2010, it was $1.63 trillion. That is double the figure of the year 2000. The US accounts for 43% of military spending, an 81% increase on the year 2001, and its defense budget is 10 times of its rival, China. 10 times larger. Okay, the arms companies. The profits of the US arms companies have quadrupled in the past decade. BAE Systems, a British company, had the second largest arms sales of any company in the world in 2009. If we combine BAE Systems UK with its operations in the US and Australia, then it has the largest arms sales in 2009 by far. In 2005, British arms sales to Africa reached a new high of £1 billion. Weapons sales from Britain to Africa increased by 4 times between 1999 and 2004. 11 out of the top 100 arms companies are based in Britain. According to the Ministry of Defence, the UK security sector has 18,000 companies and employs 335,000 people in this country. Arms are an integral part of the British economy. War is business to this government. In Britain, there is no tobacco, no cotton, no rubber, or not much mineral resources. So how comes we have all of this stuff? There are no rainforests. We barely have enough oil even to sustain ourselves. In Britain, I think there's something like 1.4 million barrels per day produced in oil, but Britain exports a lot of that to European countries, and also it purchases now a lot of its oil from Norway rather than the Middle East, because it found that the Middle East was too volatile and too difficult to predict. But still, a significant proportion of British oil imports comes from Africa. It's a small percentage, I think, at the moment, but they are definitely seeking to increase that as oil resources become more scarce and, you know, British oil runs out, because every year that 1.4 billion barrels per day is going down to 1 billion. The resources in this country are running out when it comes to oil. The US still consumes vast quantities of oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman. That's kind of expected since they, led that occupation. However, in 2007, US oil imports from Africa, which mostly come from Nigeria, Angola, Chad, Congo, Brazzaville, Equatorial Guinea and Gabon, surpassed those of the Middle East for the first time. Yeah, so we cannot underplay the continent, the underexploited continent of Africa, and what it means to the countries that dominate the market economies and consume the most. As China moves into Africa, bringing competitive loans, building roads and schools, the West begins to ramp up its anti-Chinese propaganda. Suddenly the Western governments say the Chinese prefer to work with non-democratic governments, with despots, cries of human rights abuses. They clearly have short memories of their own colonial exploitation and imperialist domination and dealings with some of the most corrupt and disgusting leaders ever, and creating them. Thank you. We can expect more of this media brainwashing to come as conditions intensify with as Chinese production grows faster in comparison to European and the production in the United States. I won't say American because the United States is one country in the Americas. But let's remember something about China before we go nuts. China does not have military bases scattered around the Middle East and Africa. China does not fund $298 million into the Africa Command military operation in the African continent. China does not fund the Amazon forces which tear apart East Africa and occupy Somalia. Who do you think are the real threat to world peace? Despite China taking a capitalist resource pillaging trend in Africa in order to feed consumerism here in Europe, why should we listen to the Western capitalist media to tell us it's a threat? We need to make our own decisions, our own minds up about these things, our own research. We don't listen to the enemy to tell us something about their enemy. If anything, China is a threat to British interests in Africa. But this tells us little other than the British government is worried about its world dominance in the region. We need to come to the realization that if African people can deal with China over the inferior imperialist corporations of the IMF and the World Bank, then they should do so. Okay, I want to talk briefly about the alternative. Solidarity, development and democracy. The Cuban government funds programs across Latin America, Africa, Asia with medical personnel who help people suffering from debilitating illnesses like cataracts and also helping with natural disasters like in Haiti. To what gain is this done? Working with Venezuelan doctors, Cuban medical professionals have helped to carry out 2 million eye and cataract operations on Venezuelan people. Also, the Cuban sports program, Barrio Adentro Deportivo, which is like barrio sports, I guess, translation, barrio like, ghetto areas, has contributed to improving people's quality of life by allowing 4 million Venezuelans to practice sports in their spare time, which was previously not possible because the resources, the sports trainers didn't exist. They were not trained, The National Sports Institute, along with the Cuban sports collaborators, kicked off a training program in 335 municipalities in all 24 Venezuelan states. Therefore, Venezuelan oil, because we're talking about oil here a lot, comes to Cuba through solidarity in trade for these medical and other services at a reduced price. Venezuelan people are seeing the benefits of their now nationalized oil industry, and the Cubans also benefit hugely. Inside socialist Cuba, there are no Cuban medical or consumer corporations and businesses to contend with, no stock market, certainly no speculation of currencies, food prices and raw materials other than the conditions that are imposed on it by the capitalist world. The state operates for the people and it is run by the people. Cuba has carried out a total of 17 million treatments across Latin America. 17 million, including a presence in Asia and Africa. 2,000 Cuban doctors work across Africa. Perhaps that is not a lot, but consider Cuba's population is less than 10 million. In this country, 65 million. I hope that got 64, I don't know, something like that. How can Cuba achieve this? when Britain cannot. All the wealth and capital that is in this country, and Britain cannot achieve a similar program. Ask yourself how that is possible. And also tens of thousands of Africans have studied in Cuban universities for free. Cuba has programs of solidarity with the oppressed nations, despite Cuba being an oppressed nation itself. Why can Britain not do the same? Back to Ho Chi Minh once again, the Vietnamese anti-imperialist, who noted further in 1924 that according to Lenin, the victory of the revolution in Western Europe depends on its close contact with the national liberation movement against imperialism in the colonies and dependent countries. Today that sounds taken for granted, maybe, yeah? That we must unite, hands off Somalia. We must unite the struggle here, whether you're Somali, non-Somali, wherever you're from, you must unite that struggle here within an imperialist country to a country that has been impressed by imperialism. But in 1924, that was not the case. The Labour Party did not take that stand in 1924. And it doesn't now. Yeah? Prior to the war, Ramsay MacDonald had committed Labour to this, that's the First World War, I guess, committed Labour to support for so-called socialist colonial policy, during a debate on the subject at a 1907 International Conference of Socialists in Stuttgart. In 1917, a Labour memorandum on war aims explained, "It is impractical in Africa to leave the various peoples concerned to settle their own destinies," describing them as non-adult races. Yeah? Okay, Labour cannot use this blatant racist terminology today. Yeah, but we have to understand their history and what they represent today in the landscape of British politics. In January 1918, in a reply to the Bolshevik Russian peace proposals, Labour was to argue that nobody contends that the black races can govern themselves. They can only make it known that the particular government under which they have been living is bad in some or all respects, and indicate the specific evils from which they desire liberation. In practice, Labour was never to champion the cause of colonial freedom. Its overriding concern was to preserve the integrity of the British Empire. Okay. So we know about Ho Chi Minh, we know about Che Guevara, Castro, Lumumba, Nkrumah, Sankara. We know about these revolutionaries, but the goal today is not to know everything, like the previous comrade says. That is not, don't be frightened by that prospect. It's not, the goal is not to know everything about Africa or to study for a lifetime to be a scholar and never step out into the streets. That's right. We must take action. You must study to take action. Join a campaign and you study as you go. Yeah, you don't lock yourself up in a library doing a PhD unless you can also make time to be part of Hands Off Somalia. The point is to understand imperialism, but to study it with a view on what can be done today. Living in Britain, one of the oldest imperialist powers, our problems indeed start here. Study Africa of inspiration to oppose imperialism here and place action at the forefront of everything that you believe in. Thank you very much.